Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections. In the analysis part, we'll first have a comprehensive discussion with respect to the importance of public education system in the country, the related challenges, and the way forward. Then, in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the meaning of antimicrobial resistance and the measures needed to deal with it. Then, in the simplified section, we'll have a discussion with respect to 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2025 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of the day, this is with respect to why India needs strong public schools. If I go back little into the history, what I see is that since 1990s, on an average, there has been a rise in the disposable income of people. And in that line, there has also been the rise in the number of private schools across the country. The question is why? Because the parents and the guardians, they perceive these schools as those entities which provide better quality education as compared to the government schools. However, with time, these private schools have had their own issues. For example, the arbitrary fee hikes by these private schools, or the discriminatory practices in these schools. On the other hand, we have certain challenges which are being faced by the whole education system. I'm talking about the school education system. For example, the detention of the students. Then we have the accessibility and affordability issues. Then we have the surveillance by the law enforcement agencies, surveillance of these students by the law enforcement agencies. So what we are trying to say is that the panacea, that the cure lies in having a robust public education system, primarily because of the affordability concerns. So what we'll today do is, we'll look at the status of the public education system in the country, the importance of public education in a country like India. Then we'll talk about the challenges which the whole education system faces, including the public education as well as the private education. Now, this topic is really going to be very important, especially the points of discussion. They can be really important from the mains perspective. Now, this is a part of GS2, social sector education. Now, when I talk about the constitutional and policy framework with respect to the education, at the base lies the Article 21 A, which provides the fundamental right to free and compulsory education to children between the age group of 6 to 14 years of age. Then we have Right to Education Act of 2009. Now this provides a statutory framework with respect to the kind of standards there needs to be in the school. For example, the infrastructure, or the people-teacher ratio, right? So this provides the whole framework. Or it also talks about the quota for the economically weaker students. 25% of the seats, even in the unaided private schools, they are to be reserved for the economically weaker sections. Then we have the National Education Policy, quite recent and very important. Because National Education Policy, it talks about the early childhood care and education. It talks about the vocational training. It talks about the standardized testing. So this is the base with respect to the school education, the Article 21A, Right to Education Act 2009 and National Education Policy 2020. Now, when I talk about the status of public education system in the country, let's have a discussion. First, what is the scale and reach of the public education system? In total, according to the UDI's plus data, Unified District Information System for Education of 2021-22. In total, there are around 14.9 lakh schools across the country. And out of these, almost 10.2 lakh are public schools, almost 70%. That is, you have to understand. So almost 30 to 35% are basically the private schools, and then almost 70% are the government schools. Next aspect is that more than 70% of the school-going children, they are in these government schools. And in absolute terms, it tunes to almost 12 crore. Next aspect is, what is the public spending on education? So, in total, inclusive, the total public spending on the education in India, it stands to be almost 2.9% of GDP. Now, again, understand, and this is with respect to the financial year 2022 and 23. We have had many commissions on education. For example, the very famous Kothari Commission of 1966. Or let's talk about the National Education Policy. Now, it has set a target of around 6%. There has to be the spending of around 6% of GDP on the education. So this is the target. But as of now, the level is at 2.9% of GDP. Also, what you have to understand is that the major expenditure with respect to the education, it is borne by the states. Almost 60 to 65% of the overall expenditure on the education, it is borne by the states. Now, again, this is with respect to almost all the social sector, even for the health aspect. So this is something which you should understand. Now, whenever I talk about the infrastructure and resources, just look at the data. According to the UDI's Plus data of 2021-22, 82% of the schools have functional girls' toilet. 92.3% of the schools have drinking water facilities. Just imagine, still we have certain schools, still almost 8%, 7 to 8% of the school do not have the drinking water facilities. Then 75.8% have electricity connections. Almost 24% do not have electricity connections. Then computer availability, only in 41% of the schools. Then let's talk about the internet access. A dismal 25.6% of the schools. So just understand, if we do not have the internet connectivity, a robust internet connectivity, how we would have access to the ICT tools, how we would have access to the smart classes. That is a very grave concern. Next aspect, let's talk about the learning outcomes and quality. So we have the Apr report, the annual state of education report. Now you need to tell me which is the non-governmental organization which publishes the Apr report. Do type in the comment section. Now, according to this, in the year 2022, only 42.8% of the class 5th student were basically able to read a class 2nd text. Then only 20.5% of the class 5th student were able to solve a basic numerical question of class 2nd. So that is the level of learning outcomes. Very serious. Now also, this particular report talked about the steady learning deficit. Now this is primarily because of the restrictions on the learnings imposed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. That is, you have to understand, the learning deficit. Now, if I talk about the teacher availability, as of now, as of 2023, there are almost 1 million vacancies, almost 10 lakh vacant seats for the teachers across the country when I talk about the public education system. And again, there is a high percentage of contract and para teachers. So most of these schools, they are basically employing these contract teachers. So this would lead to the quality issues because they do not have the requisite qualifications. That is what you have to understand. Also, the people teacher ratio is 26:1. Now this is on an average 26:1. And the mandated people teacher ratio according to the right to education is 30:1. So it's almost at that level. But the thing which you have to understand is that there are some areas, some pockets where the people teacher ratio is quite bad, right? Now, when I talk about the enrollment and dropouts, just look at this. So the gross enrollment ratio as per UDI's Plus data of 2021-22, at the elementary level, it was around 104.8%. Then at the secondary level, what I talk about the class 9th and 10th, it was around 80%. Senior secondary, it was 57.6%. So you can see that there is the continuous dropout of the students, dropout rates. Upper primary 2.6%, then it increases further to 12.6% when I talk about the secondary education. Then it further increases to over 17% for senior secondary. So this is a very grave concern, and we'll talk about the kind of reasons which are attributed to the higher dropout rates, right? Now, next aspect is what you have to understand, that when I talk about these students, majority of the students who are basically dropping out of the school, they belong to this particular category, the marginalized sections. That is the girls, the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, or the other backward classes. That is what you have to understand. Next, the digital divide. Less than 30% of the rural India has access to the digital gadgets. And this is a very serious issue because if they would not have the adequate connectivity or adequate digital devices, then obviously they would not be able to access the e-learning platforms. That is one of the very serious concern, and the data is given by the Apr report of 2021. Also, as I said, the COVID-19 pandemic, it has basically widened the learning inequalities, right? So the learning outcomes are not at par with the kind of expectations we have, and it is primarily because of the COVID-19 induced restrictions on the overall system. Now, what is the importance of public education system in a country like India? When I talk about public education system, what you have to understand is that this ensures equitable access to education. please understand that almost 70% of the students across the country, they are basically enrolled in the public education systems, in the public schools. 70%, a very big number. Also, it is these public schools which cater to the needs of socially and educationally disadvantaged groups. So this primarily caters to these sections, the marginalized sections, the vulnerable sections, and they can then have the access to quality education in these public schools. And this then further acts as a labeler with respect to the kind of disparities we have. So it is trying to label those disparities in the society. Then, according to the Apr report of 2022, more than 80% of the SCs and STs in the country, they are basically study in these public schools. Next aspect is that it promotes social justice and inclusion. See, we have the constitutional mandate, which is very well defined in the preamble also. The values of equality, justice, right? So, through the public education system, we can manifest, we can realize the constitutional mandate of equality, right to education, justice, right? Next, that these public schools, they create shared learning spaces. What do I mean by that? That if we have these shared learning spaces, this would bridge the gaps between the different castes, the different classes, right? So it would make the society more par. It would make the society more equal. That is what the importance is. Next, it safeguards the democratic values. See, in public schools, there is an emphasis on certain values, the constitutional values. And it basically gives importance. It nurtures and inculcates some of the very important values like pluralism, or it talks about, let's say, diversity, or it talks about the tolerance. So that is really very important, right? The next aspect is, if we have a good, robust public education system, then it reduces the intergenerational poverty. And many times what has been seen is that these schools have acted as the instruments for poverty elimination, because they have provided the education to those students who could not have attended the private schools. And ultimately, they were basically come out of that poverty trap because of the educations and then the other skills acquired by them, right? So it equips the children with vocational skills, with other skills which they can use for the livelihood generation. So that becomes very important. Then it also builds the human capital at scale. The public education system, which caters to almost 70% of the students in the country, please understand, it lays the foundation for the economic growth of the country, for the competitiveness of the country, for innovation, for entrepreneurship. So this becomes really important. Also, India's demographic dividend. When I talk about demographic dividend, what I'm referring to is that we have a population, more than 50% of the total population is less than 30 years of age. So this really helps. This facilitates the conversion of this demography into a dividend, right? And also, we have the largest share in the world. When I talk about the school going children, almost 25 crores. So this becomes really important. Next, it acts as a check on the commercialization of education. As I told you, that there has been a growth of private education schools across the country. But these public education schools, they act as non-profit alternative, where the only objective is on the education, right? Also, it protects from exploitation. Exploitation, because what we have been observing, that there is this particular exploitation in these private schools with respect to arbitrary fee hikes, with respect to, let's say, discriminatory practices being practiced in these schools. So they have their own norms that they would admit whom and they would not admit whom. So these are arbitrary norms being practiced by these private schools. Next, public accountability and transparency. Many a time what has been observed is that these private schools, they're not accountable to anyone. They have their own policies. But these public schools, they are accountable. They are accountable to the citizens. They are accountable to the elected representatives. So over there, their overall transparency increases. The way they function, it increases, right? Also, we have the school management committees. Now, the school management committees, they include the parents. And therefore, the overall working of these schools enhances. Now, what are the current issues and challenges in the overall education system? Again, when I'm talking about the education system, I'm including the private as well as the public education system so that we can cover in a more comprehensive manner. The very first is high dropout and push out rates. See, we generally use the term dropout rates. We do not basically call it push out rates. Why? Because what we fail to basically accept is that it is not basically the dropout. It is primarily because of the lack of support which is given by the whole system to these students. There is no support. There is the kind of academic pressure which these students have, and it is not being, there are no remedial measures which are being taken in order to avoid that. And ultimately, these students are pushed to basically drop out. So it is basically the pushing out of these students rather than dropping out. Please understand the difference. What we generally think is that because of their own reasons, they're dropping out. No, it's not because of that. It's primarily because of the lack of support the system is giving to these students, or primarily because of the academic pressure which these students are facing, right? Girls face higher dropout rates, primarily because of their obligations towards the family or early marriages. That is one of the very important issues, or safety concerns. Then there is this detention. See, again, understand what we are trying to say is recently what we have seen is that students are being detained in class 11th. You would ask why. They are being detained in class 11th across schools, so that those schools can basically show it to the world that they have good results in class 12th. If they would promote a particular student who is not performing well in class 11 to class 12th, there are chances that that student might fail in class 12th. So the schools, what they're doing is they are actually detaining those students in class 11th itself. This is arbitrary. This is basically irrational. This is what the report says. Next, impact of no detention policy rollback. Please understand. Initially, the right to education, it talked about the no detention policy. What it said was that we will not detain students in different classes. Instead, what we'll have is continuous and comprehensive evaluation, CCE. Accordingly, if we see that a particular student is not performing well, we'll have remedial measures, but we'll not detain the students. In 2019, what happened was that amendment was done to this particular policy, and no detention policy was basically scrapped. Also, we have the National Education Policy 2020, which also gives an impetus to the detention policy. Recently, in 2024, the government of India also implemented this detention policy in Kendriya Vidyalayas, in Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas, right? So again, understand what is the issue if detention policy is implemented. See, if you'll have detention policy, there would be increased dropouts, because there would be a fear of failure among the students. There would be increased stress. Again, most of these students who are in these schools, they do not have adequate resources. Many of these students are also working on a part-time basis. So if you will have the detention policy, initially there was no detention policy, so they were not in the stress mode, right? But if you'll have the detention policy, what would happen is that there would be increased stress and they would have the fear of failure. Ultimately, they would drop out from the schools. That is one of the reasons. Next, fee hikes and commercialization in private schools. There have been arbitrary fee hikes in these private schools and no reason is being provided. For example, you must have seen the case which happened in DPS Dwarka, and the Delhi High Court has termed these schools who are basically having these arbitrary hikes in the fees as money-making machines. See, education is something which should be ideally a non-profit activity. But these schools, the elite schools, what we say, they are just raising the limits, the fees limits to such levels which normally a middle class person cannot afford. So that is one of the very serious issues. Also, there has been stratification of schools. Education is something which we have stratified. What right now we are having is those private elite schools providing the rich curriculum, and the fees, it runs into lakhs of rupees. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have these government schools, underfunded, under-resourced, which do not even have the proper number of teachers, do not offer the quality education. So we are at the extremes, and this is obviously not good for a democracy like India, where we should focus upon the equality, where we should see, again, what we're trying to say is education should be seen as a right. It should not be a privilege, and that is what the issue lies over here. Now, inadequate infrastructure and basic facilities. We already talked about it. We do not have the minimum basic access to the electricity, to the toilets. Especially, just imagine, you have girls studying in the college. So this situation becomes very, very tough, right? Or basic facilities, be it the functional toilets or electricity or even the playgrounds. Or let's talk about the laboratories or libraries. They are not present. Let alone the libraries. There is no electricity in the school. So this is a very serious issue. And it obviously affects the learning outcomes, which the ASA report talks about. Next, we have the teacher vacancies. I told you that as of now, we have the vacancies to the tune of almost 10 lakhs across the country. This is a huge number, 10 lakhs. And we are not recruiting the permanent teachers. Instead, we are having these contract teachers who do not have the adequate qualifications. The quality is compromised in that aspect. Training and pedagogical issues are also there. So training is not properly done, or the kind of way in which they are teaching, the pedagogy is not adequate. Students are unable to basically to imbibe the kind of knowledge which is being provided by these teachers in the school. So that is a very serious issue. Also, we have the report by UNESCO, the State of Education report of 2021, which said that almost 20% of teachers in the rural areas in India, they do not have the adequate training. That is a very serious issue. Next aspect is the low public investment in education. We are just investing almost 2.9% of the GDP on education, the public spending. And this is far below the global average. And let's not talk about the developed countries like Sweden or US or other countries. Let's talk about the countries like Brazil or Indonesia. They are spending a lot on the school education. And also, we have our own target. We have our own target of almost 6%. And we are unable to basically touch it. So this is a very serious issue. Next aspect is that we have segregated. See, you must have heard about the PM Shri schools, or what we call as the model schools. We are investing a lot in the model schools so that they can serve as the inspiration for the other schools. But what it is leading to is a stratification, where we are giving more importance to a particular school or certain number of schools, and other schools are left behind. So this is model schools versus the regular schools. These regular schools, they are understaffed, under-resourced. Next aspect is the policy contradiction and centralization. See, we have had the Right to Education Act. Now, Right to Education Act was something which basically talked about the inclusive education, localized education. On the other hand, we have the National Education Policy of 2020, which is more centralized, which is talking about the language and other stuffs. So there is a contradiction. That is one of the very important issues. Also, the National Education Policy's model schools. As I told you, we have the PM Shri schools, schools for rising India. So we are trying to make up a particular model school so that other schools can seek the inspiration from this particular school. What is happening is this is creating a divide between this particular model school and the other regular schools. Then, criminalization and surveillance of dropouts. See, we all know that in public schools, majority of the students who are basically studying, they are from the marginalized sections, from the minorities, the girls, or from the SCs, STs. Recently, we had the Delhi government, which basically gave the permission to the Delhi police to basically see that if students are dropping out from the schools, please have a data. Please study on the kind of students who are basically dropping out. Go and then counsel them. Can you imagine a situation where the Delhi police is going and counseling those students who are dropping out? Don't you think that it would basically, have this perception? Can you even imagine the Delhi police counseling those students? It would be more sort of a harassment for those students. Because, see, again, what the Delhi police says is, because if they're dropping out, they're more prone to the drug activities, drug consumption activities. Let's say a particular student dropped out because of the kind of circumstances he had, right? So are we basically criminalizing that particular student? So that should not be done. This is a particular issue. Delhi government shares a dropout list with the Delhi police, and it criminalizes the children, especially those children who are from the marginalized communities, be it the minorities, the SCs, STs. This is a very serious issue. Next aspect is language barriers and rote learning. In most of the schools, especially in the private schools, please understand, there is an excessive focus upon English as a medium of education. See, there is nothing wrong with it. But what the studies have shown is that the early education, the primary education, should be in the mother tongue of the students. It leads to the better cognitive development of that particular student. So we should emphasize upon learning in the mother tongue. That should be the objective. Next, it alienates the first generation learners. What we are trying to say, let's say you have a particular student, a child, whose parents are uneducated. And if you are basically educating that child in English medium, he won't be able to absorb the knowledge. He would have been able to absorb the knowledge if his parents knew English. So those first generation learners who do not have, whose parents do not basically have the adequate educational skills or educational knowledge, they should be taught specifically in the mother tongue. That is what we are trying to talk about. Also, the emphasis right now is on rote memorization, which again, this is absolutely incorrect, because if you want to develop the critical aptitude, the critical thinking, what the national education policy talks about, the rote memorization should not be focused upon, right? So these are certain issues which the overall education system is facing. Now, what are the way forward with respect to strengthening the public education in India? Because ultimately, the public education is more affordable, and that is a panacea. The very first is increase public investment in education. There have to be increased expenditure on the public education so that it can have better infra in terms of the digital connectivity, better infra in terms of the buildings, providing the toilet facilities, providing the playgrounds, the labs, the libraries. So this is really important. Also, adequate salaries must be given to the teachers and the administrative staff working in the schools, so that they have the incentive to perform better. Then what is really important is focus upon the learning resources. So the learning resources can also be in the e-mode, right? E-learning. For example, we have PM e-Vidya, right? Or we have Swayam portal. So that needs to be provided to the students. Next is ensure the full implementation of the Right to Education Act. See, there are certain norms which have to be fulfilled by different schools. The infrastructure norms, or let's say the people-teacher ratio, or let's say the other norms with respect to the quality of education which is being provided, or let's say the quota, that is the quota for the economically weaker sections, students from the EWS sections, right? Even in the unaided schools, that has to be followed, right? We should focus upon the teacher vacancies. You must have seen recently the Supreme Court castigated the West Bengal government, right? That please, as soon as possible, fill those vacancies, because that is really important. If you do not have the adequate number of teachers in these public schools, how would the education be done in these schools? How the knowledge transmission would take place? Definitely not. Inclusion of disadvantaged groups, right? So we need to basically cater to these section of the society, the disadvantaged groups. Provide them the additional resources, provide them the necessary care which they need, right? Next, reviving and strengthening the no detention policy. Again, what we are trying to focus upon is that please come back to the no detention policy, because the continuous and comprehensive evaluation was really very important. It did not lead to the fear among the students. There was no stress, right? And it had all the remedial measures with respect to enhancing the overall knowledge levels of the students. So that is really very important. CC-based progression should be accepted. Then we have improved the quality of teaching and learning. There should be universal in-service training. For example, we have Nishtha, right, with respect to the training of these teachers. So such programs need to be enhanced, need to be made more broad-based with respect to the training of these teachers, right? Enhanced recruitment needs to be there. Recruitments need to be done with respect to filling these vacancies in these schools, the teachers. Use of mother tongue and local languages, which can increase the cognitive absorption of knowledge by these students. So that is really important. Curb the unregulated growth of private schools. See, we are not saying that stop the private schools from growing, right? There would be a complete ban on these private schools. No, we are not saying that. What we are saying is there have to be a proper regulatory structure, so that it can basically infuse the transparency. See, if you are increasing the fee by X amount, why you are doing so? What is the basis of that particular thing? So there has to be a proper transparency. And for that, regulatory authorities must be set up in different states, so that it can infuse the transparency, and strict action must be taken against those schools who are basically not following or not abiding by these policies, right? By these rules. Next, modernize the infrastructure and reduce the digital divide. There have to be an adequate emphasis on the digital infrastructure, be it the e-learning modes, right? As I told you, the PM e-Vidya or the Swayam channel, right? So they need to be enhanced, so that the students, even in the remote areas, they can have access to the quality education through the internet. Provide smart classrooms or libraries or laboratories, very important. Then prevent the dropouts and pushing outs. If you see, a particular student who can basically drop out because of its family circumstances or other reasons, please look on that particular student. Give importance to that particular student. Identify the early signs and then have those remedial measures. Because this, obviously, if a student is dropping out, definitely it's not good for the student and also the nation as a whole, right? Avoid criminalizing the children. We need not to have these law enforcement agencies basically surveilling these children or counseling these children. right? They are not in a capacity to basically counsel these children. How can you expect Delhi police counseling these small children? Not at all. Expand the National Institute of Open Schooling. This is really important. In this particular article of the Indian Express, the author says that many of the girls, see, NIOS is something which provides the flexibility to the students, especially the girls, right? So we need to expand such opportunities. NIOS need to be expanded. Integrate vocational education. Very, very important. The national education policy talks about the vocational education. But see, what it is trying to say is, it is focusing too much on the vocational education. So it should not be seen as a substitute to the education, to the normal, numerical, or let's say the arithmetic abilities. It should not be seen as a substitute. It can be an additional option, but not a substitute to the basic numeracy or basic reading, right? Then community participation should be enhanced so as to increase the overall accountability with respect to the functioning of these schools. For example, the right to education talks about the school management committees, which basically include the parent also. So they need to be expanded, right? And such a system should also be there with respect to the private schools, right? Next, social audits, third-party audits should take place so that they can see that what are basically the loopholes in the working of these private schools or even the public schools. And then measures can be taken for the rectification. So again, understand what we are trying to say is public schools have really done good. They are suffering, they are under-resourced, but the only solution lies, if you really see it from the affordability aspect, the solution lies in having proper resources. Proper resources need to be given to these public schools, right? We are not saying that stop the private schools, definitely not. But what we are saying is, on one hand, make sure that adequate resources are given to these public schools and there is a proper regulatory structure. On the other hand, there has to be a proper structure for the private schools also, so that there can be a transparency in the kind of way in which they are working. So this is, you have to understand from the perspective of the whole education system. I try to cover in almost every manner, and believe me, if you just remember these points, you can have these points as very valid points in the answer, and this would enhance the credibility of your answer. Let's have a mains practice question. A strong and inclusive public education system is the cornerstone of social justice and democratic development in India. Yet it remains underfunded and increasingly neglected. Critically examine the present status of the public education system in India, discuss the key challenges it faces, and suggest a robust way forward. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer of this particular question. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, if you're liking the enriched content, please do not forget to press the like button and do let us know in the comment section. Let us go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the menace of antimicrobial resistance. See, we know that in nature, we have different kinds of microbes. For example, viruses, fungi, or bacteria, or parasites. On the other hand, on the basis of the advancements in the medical science, we were able to create a lot of antimicrobials. For example, the antibiotics, antivirals, antimalarials. But with time, what we have seen, because of the inadequate usage or because of the misuse of these antimicrobials, there has been the resistance in these microbes with respect to these medicines. And it is in this context that the Drugs Controller General of India has been urged to lay down the strict pathways for the new antibiotics so that they are not misused by the practitioners. Because if you will have the misuse of these antimicrobials, it would increase the resistance. Because we have a selected bunch of medicines, right? So if there would be an increase in the resistance shown by these microbes, there would not be an effective treatment. So this topic becomes really important. We'll see what antimicrobial resistance is all about. We'll see what are basically the reasons and what can be the way forward, right? Now, let's see what is antimicrobial resistance. I already told you that this is a kind of a resistance which is acquired by any microorganism. It can be a virus, it can be a bacteria, it can be a fungi, it can be a parasite, anything. Right. So it is becoming more resistant to the kind of medicines which are being given to the patient, right? Against the antimicrobial drugs. What can be the antimicrobial drugs? For example, the antibiotics, antivirals, antimalarials, right? What is the consequence? The consequence is that the standard treatment becomes ineffective. Because if these medicines won't work, definitely the person would not be able to recover, and these medicines become ineffective on that particular person, and the infection persists. and it can also spread to the other people, creating a public concern, right? So this is the particular issue. Now, again, understand, is the development of resistance in these microbes a natural phenomena? The answer is absolutely yes. But what is being seen is, because of the misuse, because of the overuse of these antimicrobes, let's say the antibiotics, or let's say the antivirals, there has been a sudden growth of increase in the resistance shown by these microbes. So one of the most important reasons which can be attributed to the development of resistance in these microbes is that there is the overuse or the misuse of these antimicrobial medications, aggravated by the injudicious use of these things. Also, there is what we say, a particular terminology, what we call as the superbugs, who are resistant to almost all the kinds of antimicrobial medications we have, be it the antibiotics or the antivirals. So this is what we call as superbugs. World Health Organization has basically said that antimicrobial resistance is one of the top 10 causes, threats to the global health, right? Here is a particular description of how the antimicrobial resistance, it basically spreads. Just see that if we have a particular animal which is being given the medications, right? Animal get the antibiotics and develop the resistance, then either in the form of meat or in the form of the kind of, let's say, the fertilizers or water containing the animal faces and drug resistance bacteria, it goes into the soil, and ultimately that particular bacteria also goes into the plant. Now, whenever you'll have the consumption of either the meat or the plants, these plants, it can basically transfer these resistant bacteria or other microbes into the body of the human, right? And then the kind of antimicrobials you are basically giving to the person, they would become ineffective, right? And again, let's say the John gets the antibiotics and develop the resistant bacteria in his system. Now, this can also spread to other people, right? And let's say if he stays in the hospital for a longer time, then it can also spread to other people in the hospitals, what we call as the nosocomial infections. Remember these terms, nosocomial infections, the hospital acquired infections. That is what you have to understand. So this is basically, again, understand what we're trying to say is that because we do not have the absolute cure, because there is the inadequate or usage of these antimicrobials, there's a resistance, and this can further spread to different people, and this is a grave public health concern. Now, what are the reasons for the spread? First is high prevalence of communicable disease, especially in developing countries or least developed countries. For example, India is a developing country. In countries like India, we have high prevalence of communicable disease. Let's say tuberculosis or diarrhea or respiratory tract infections. So again, if you'll have higher prevalence of these disease, definitely there can be the increase of resistance, increase of antimicrobial resistance in different patients across the country, right? Next, we already have an overburdened public health system. So this basically limits the laboratory capacity. Timely diagnostics is not available, right? And ultimately the targeted treatment is not, we're not able to apply that particular treatment regime on time, right? Because there's a delay. Till that time, already the resistance has developed and ultimately the treatment fails. Next, poor infection control practices. There are issues with respect to water, sanitation and hygiene, hygiene issues are there. And this basically gives a very good environment for these bacteria to flourish, right? There are lapses in the hospitals and clinics. What I told you, the nosocomial infections, the hospital acquired infections, HAI, remember this. Then there is injudicious use. See, generally, when you go to the doctor, you say that, let's say a person says that I have issue in the throat or something like that. The doctor gives a particular medicine. Sometimes what you must have seen is the patient himself forces the doctor that please give me some antibiotics. And if the doctor doesn't give him that, so that person feels that the doctor is not well qualified. So in that particular mode, the doctor has to give the antibiotics to that particular patient, even if it is not required. Most of the fevers, most of these issues, they are because of the viruses. So antibiotics, they are actually ineffective. But there is the pressure on the doctor to please prescribe these medications. So there is over prescription, not needed, or there is self-medication. Let's say a person is having issues in the throat or something like that. He goes to a particular shop, right? And then asks for these medicines. And they are freely available, over the counter availability. right? There are no, as such, there are no restrictions which are placed on the sale of these medicines. So there is the over self-medication or the misuse. The doctor told you to have this particular regime, take these antibiotics for 5 days, and you've just taken it for 2 days. So there can be the development of resistance with respect to that particular microbe. That is what the issue is. Unnecessary use, or again, understand, we have a particular category of antibiotics, the broad spectrum antibiotics, which are not to be used normally, which are used in specific cases, but people are consuming it normally. So ultimately, when you will have, let's say a person is having the issue with respect to a particular bacteria, if that person is consuming these broad spectrum antibiotics, it would lead to the enhancement of the resistance in that particular bacteria. And then the medicine would be ineffective, right? Its efficacy would not be there. This is a very serious issue. Also, we have the easy access, unregulated over-the-counter availability of these medicines, these medications in different shops. Then there is lack of awareness. People are not really aware of the kind of serious issues these antimicrobial resistance can have. People are not really aware. And that is the reason that they are indiscriminately consuming these medications. Next, limited surveillance. What the problem is that the public, we are more dependent on the public health infrastructure, and the public health infrastructure is not very good in India. It's not very robust. So there are issues with respect to the surveillance. Timely diagnostics is not there. There can be a possible spread of the disease, and that disease is because of, let's say, a particular microbe which is resistant. So definitely it leads to very serious issues. Now, before I proceed further, I want you to tell me that what is basically the gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. Just in 2 lines, try to explain. I would be really very happy. Tell me what is gram-positive and gram-negative, and which is the one which is sort of the antibiotics are less effective on which one of these two. Do let me know in the comment section. What are the implications of the spread of antimicrobial resistance? The very first is healthcare impact. It's very natural, because if you will have these antibiotics, the normal course of antibiotics, if they are ineffective, definitely a more higher form of treatment would be required, and that would basically consume more resources, more cost to the patient. So it increases the overall healthcare costs. And over here, please understand, we're not just talking about the out-of-pocket expenditure with respect to that particular individual. We're talking about the overall burden which the health system would have in a particular country. Next, increase healthcare costs. And again, see, what we are trying to say is, if we do not have the adequate treatment options, adequate antibiotics, definitely it would render the person in that particular disease, in that state of disease. And it can also increase the mortality rates, even for those disease for which, you had already previously, you had, medications to cure that particular disease. But because of the enhanced resistance, the person suffers, to that particular extreme level that in certain situations he even succumbs, right? So this is one of the very serious issues. Resistant infections, they are more expensive, and prolonged therapies may be required. If the normal antibiotics or antimicrobials are not working upon the particular person, you need more advanced therapies, and obviously they are costly. Next, challenges in the medical procedures. See, understand, there are certain procedures, for example, let's say surgeries or cancer chemotherapy or organ transplant. If there is the prevalence of resistance in the bacteria, there can be, these surgeries can be more risky. It can lead to the death of the patient, right? So again, what we are trying to say is, because of the resistance which is developed in these microbes, it also has an indirect effect on the other medical procedures, be it the chemotherapy or the surgery of that particular person. Then, limitations in the treatment options. Previously manageable infections become untreatable, and it obviously increases the fatalities, right? Even for those small diseases which were previously treatable, they now become untreatable. So it increases the fatalities. Also, you can see in this particular infographic that the global deaths in 2019, which were attributable to the antimicrobial resistance, they were almost 12 lakhs. And for HIV/AIDS, it was even lesser. Even for the breast cancer, it was lesser. So this is a very serious public health concern. Now, what are the measures taken to address the AMR? So we have had the National Program on Antimicrobial Containment. The purpose is to establish these surveillance units in the state medical colleges so that they can effectively deal with this particular aspect of antimicrobial resistance. Then we have National Action Plan on AMR. See, what we are trying to do is, through this particular National Action Plan, we are focusing upon the One Health approach. where we are integrating not just the human health, but also animal health and the other components of the environment. So this is focusing upon a more broad aspect. Then we have the AMR surveillance and research network. The very objective is to provide the credible data with respect to the spread of the resistant bacteria or resistant microbes in the society. Then antimicrobial resistance research and international collaboration. For this, we have the Indian Council of Medical Research, and this has come up in partnership with different countries, be it with Norway, be it with Germany, right? So it has come up with partnership so that there can be a sharing of information with respect to the antimicrobial resistance. Then antibiotic steward program. So we have the ICMR, which has come up with different pilot projects across India to control the misuse and overuse of the antibiotics in hospital wards and ICUs. Also, we have the Drug Controller General of India. Even in this particular article, there are different people who are requesting DCGI that please have a particular pathway so that these antibiotics are not that much freely available in the market. There has to be a certain restriction imposed on them. So DCGI, it basically banned 40 FDCs, fixed dose combinations, right? So that there is no misuse of these FDCs. What have been the global measures? So global measures, the very first is that we celebrate the World AMR Awareness Week from the 18th November to 24th November, right? Just to spread the awareness with respect to what AMR is all about and how to tackle and how dangerous it can be for the human health. That is a very objective. Then we have the Global Antimicrobial Resistance and Use Surveillance System, just to make sure that adequate knowledge systems are basically transferred to different countries around the world. So this is particularly a particular initiative of WHO. So as to make sure that different countries have adequate knowledge with respect to the AMR, and then they can take proper actions with respect to it. What should be the way forward? The very first is public education campaigns. People need to be told that the misuse, the overuse, the overprescription of these antibiotics is not good, or any antimicrobial is not good, right? There have to be campaigns through the mass media or community outreach, because people are not really aware. They do not have idea with respect to the consequences which they can have. Next, antibiotic steward program. So they should be, as I just told you, we have the ICMR doing it. There can be other agencies also. We can have the state medical colleges, the district hospitals coming up and having a proper awareness program, or making sure that the kind of antibiotics which are being given to the patients, they're following that on a proper regime. Over prescription is not there, right? Strict that track and optimize the antibiotic use across the country. Regulation of antibiotic sales, very, very important. It should not be sold freely available over the counter. What we are saying is there have to be, for example, we have the red line campaign, do read about it. So there have to be restrictions placed on the sale of these antibiotics, very, very important. Stricter regulations on the sale of antibiotics. Expand the AMR surveillance, expand a nationwide AMR surveillance system, so as to know that in which particular area, what are those areas where there is a possibility of the spread of the AMR, and adequate policy interventions can be there at the right time. That is what the objective is. Develop new technologies. So we need to come up with new technology. For example, we have the phage system, right? In which we basically use a virus to kill a particular bacteria. We are not using the antibiotics. So we need to come up with different technologies, right? Those technologies which make sure that there is no development of resistance in these microbes. So again, what we are trying to say is this is a very serious public health issue, and because of that, and the primary reason is that there is the overuse, the misuse and overprescription of these antibiotics generally, or more in broad term, we can say the antimicrobials. On the second hand, the other issue is that there is a free sale. There is no restriction imposed on the sale of these antimicrobials. So ultimately, it is enhancing the resistance, which is obviously not good for the health of the people in total, right? So this is what you need to understand with respect to AMR. Let's have a mains practice question. Antimicrobial resistance is not just a medical challenge, but a silent pandemic with economic, social and developmental implications. In this context, examine the causes and consequences of AMR in India, suggest a multi-pronged strategy to address the crisis at the national and global levels. 10 marks, 150 words. Please do write a particular answer to this question. Let's go to the simplified section. Coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which talks about the International Monetary Fund. So we have the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, who has said that countries need to come together and resolve the trade disputes they have in a swift manner. Otherwise, it would have very serious consequences on the global economic growth. Now, Why she said this was primarily because of the kind of announcements which were made by US President Donald Trump, because he said that he's going to impose a list of tariffs on different countries around the world. And she has said that this basically has an effect on the investments made by different industries and also the consumer spending. So we'll see what IMF is. See, we all know that different countries might face balance of payment crisis. So in that time, you have the IMF, which comes to the rescue of those countries. And we will also talk about the different, the way in which the IMF functions and the kind of reports which are basically published by the IMF and the World Bank. So let's go through this. So the head of the International Monetary Fund has urged countries to move swiftly to resolve the trade disputes that threaten the global economic growth. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said that the unpredictability arising from the US President Donald Trump's aggressive campaign of taxes on foreign imports is causing companies to delay the investments and consumers to hold off on the spending. Now, this was said in a particular meeting of the IMF and its sister agency, the World Bank. Why do we call as the sister agency? Because it was a Bretton Woods conference in which these two organizations came up. The 191 country leading organization, which seeks to promote the global growth, financial stability and aim to reduce the poverty. Also sharply lowered its forecast for the United States. So see, in the article itself, the objectives of the IMF are itself given. Now, International Monetary Fund, when was it founded? It was conceived in July 1944 at the United Nations Bretton Woods Conference. Very important. The 44 countries in attendance sought to build a framework for the international economic cooperation and avoid repeating the competitive currency devaluations that contributed to the Great Depression of 1930s. So it was primarily a result of the Great Depressions, the issues which different countries faced. So they set up together and said that we are going to come up with a particular organization which would look into the financial aspects, the monetary aspects of the world. What kind of financial assistance does the IMF offer? Providing loans and concessional financial assistance to member countries experiencing actual or potential balance of payments problems with respect to the kind of export and imports they're having. So if a country is facing issues with respect to the foreign exchange, definitely it can basically seek the help of the IMF. The International Monetary Fund works to achieve the sustainable growth and prosperity for all its 191 member countries. And see, all these snippets have been taken from the website of the IMF itself, so that you can have the best credibility. And again, questions are actually directly sourced from the original website itself in the UPSC. So that's the particular reason. It does so by supporting the economic policies that promote the financial stability and monetary cooperation, which are essential to increase the productivity, job creation, economic well-being. The IMF is governed by and accountable to its member countries. Now, it has three critical missions. What are those three critical missions? The very first is furthering the international monetary cooperation. Second, encouraging the expansion of trade and economic growth. Third, discouraging policies that would harm prosperity. To fulfill these missions, IMF member countries work collaboratively with each other and with the other international bodies. Now, what are the other assistance which can be offered by the IMF? See, in addition to the kind of the support which the IMF gives during the balance of payment crisis, it can also provide the technical advices. Also, you must know that the kind of resources which IMF is providing, it can be either conditional or unconditional, right? So again, when India went to the IMF, when it faced the BOP crisis in the early 90s, there were conditions imposed on India that it needs to open its market. The government needs to reduce its subsidy burden, right? Again, following the free market economics, the open market principles. That is what you have to understand. The IMF provides the capacity development, which is technical assistance and training of the government officials to help member countries strengthen the economic institutions and statistics, as well as the capacities in the areas such as taxation, administration, expenditure management, monetary exchange, rate policies, financial systems and supervision, and other things. One very important thing which is related to the IMF is the special drawing rights, what we call as SDRs. So this is an international reserve asset. Understand, the IMF issues the international reserve asset known as special drawing rights that can supplement the official reserves of the member countries. So it acts as a reserve for the other countries also. Total global allocations are currently about SDR 204 billion, which almost amounts to 293 US billion dollars. IMF members can voluntarily exchange, very important statement, that the countries can voluntarily exchange these SDRs for currencies among themselves. That is what you have to understand. Now, How is the IMF funded? IMF funds come primarily from three sources. First is member quotas. Second is the credit arrangements. Third is bilateral borrowing agreements. Quotas. So you have a particular quota assigned to a different country that is based upon its overall capacity, overall economic capacity. Member quotas are the primary source of IMF funding. A member's country quota reflects its size and position in the world economy. Then you have the new arrangements to borrow. So we have the NAB between the IMF and a group of members and institutions are the main backstop for the quotas. In January 2020, the IMF Executive Board agreed to double the size of NAB to SDR 365 billion, which tunes to almost 504 US billion dollars. Bilateral borrowing agreements. Member countries can also have committed resources through the bilateral borrowing agreements. In 2020, the IMF Executive Board approved a new round of BBAs totaling to almost 138 billion SDRs, which tunes to almost 190 US billion dollars. Now, who runs the IMF? So let's study the kind of governance framework which the IMF has. IMF is accountable to its member country governments. At the top of the organizational structure is a board of governor, the topmost, the framework with respect to the governance of IMF, consisting of one governor and one alternate governor from each member country. Normally, you have the finance minister and the Reserve Bank of India governor from India. Usually the top officials from the central bank or the finance ministry. The board of governors meets once a year at the IMF World Bank annual meetings. Out of these, we have 24 countries. 25 of the governors serve on the International Monetary and Financial Committee, IMFC, very important body, which advises the IMF's executive board. So you have the board of governors, from that you have the IMFC, and IMFC basically advises the executive board. The day-to-day work of the IMF is overseen by a 25-member executive board, which represents the entire membership and is supported by the IMF staff. The managing director is head of the IMF staff and chair of the executive board and is assisted by deputy managing directors. That is what you have to understand. Now, the very important part. UPSC has asked a lot of questions with respect to the kind of reports published by different organizations around the world. So this is a particular snippet of that. So you have the IMF publishing these reports: World Economic Outlook, Global Financial Stability Report, Fiscal Monitor. Do remember, generally we know about these, World Economic Outlook and Global Financial Stability Report, but this is also very important, Fiscal Monitor. On the other hand, we have World Bank coming up with different reports. For example, the World Development Report, and these are prepared by the World Bank. Again, I'm emphasizing. World Development Report, Global Economic Prospects, important, keep a track of this because probably a question can come in the prelims. And Poverty and Shared Prosperity series. Also, we have the Ease of Doing Business, that is basically published by the World Bank. So this is what you need to know with respect to this particular topic, that is the reports which are published by the IMF and the World Bank and the other functioning aspects of the IMF. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, here's a particular news coming from Tamil Nadu that it has banned mayonnaise. Now, you all must be familiar with this particular thing. Now, why it has done so is because, according to the public officials, mayonnaise uses raw eggs and it contains a lot of pathogens. See, if you're applying the heat, if you're cooking the eggs, it's fine. So most of the pathogens get killed. But if you're using the raw eggs, there is an element of food poisoning which can be there. And the kind of bacteria which have been attributed to in this particular article is Salmonella and E. coli, right? So we'll see what are the different aspects. Citing public health risks, Tamil Nadu government has banned the manufacture, storage, distribution and sale of mayonnaise made using raw eggs, only using raw eggs. So that has been banned. The government notification banning mayonnaise described the condiment as a semi-solid emulsion containing the egg yolk, vegetable oil, vinegar and other seasonings. Traditional mayonnaise contains three basic ingredients: oil, egg yolk and an acid, usually lemon juice or vinegar. It is made by whisking egg yolks with oil, which is added in small quantities till one gets thick, pale yellow mixture. Vinegar is added at the end. Mayonnaise is the ubiquitous ingredient, almost used in everything, be it the momos or be it the shawarma, everything, right? In fast foods around the world, served with all kinds of foods, as I told you, shawarmas and Nepali momos. Why was the egg mayonnaise banned? Eggs are known to carry many pathogens which are usually neutralized in the cooking process. So if you are cooking it naturally with the application of heat, they basically get neutralized. But the mayonnaise uses raw eggs. The Tamil Nadu government notification said that mayonnaise made of raw eggs is a high risk food as it carries the risk of food poisoning. This is especially relevant in Indian conditions where improper preparation and storage amid hot and humid weather conditions creates additional risk of contamination by microorganisms. So if we have this India, in most of the places we have these climatic conditions which are hot and humid, and now this gives a boost to the production of these bacteria. So this can further aggravate the health concerns of people. So it mentions two common bacteria, Salmonella. This is a leading cause of foodborne illnesses. For example, we have, let's say, the diarrhea and other thing. Hospitalizations and deaths. Warm, humid weather is the ideal conditions for Salmonella to grow. Symptoms of Salmonella infections include watery diarrhea, vomiting, and stomach cramps. E. coli. While most of the E. coli strains are harmless, they in fact are important for the digestive process, the E. coli bacteria. Certain kinds can cause severe illnesses. And even if you are using the raw eggs, definitely that can be a source of infection. These are known to infect the gut, the urinary tract, as well as the other parts of the body. While these bacteria can affect everyone, they pose more acute risk to the immunocompromised individuals, children, and the elderly. What will be the impact of this particular move? Over the past 2 decades, mayonnaise has become a staple in the urban Indian food culture, used with almost every kind of fast food you eat. Likely force the food businesses to switch to eggless or pasteurized egg versions. Note, however, that the mayonnaise market in India is dominated by the eggless versions anyway. So most of the mayonnaise which is used by different food outlets is basically the eggless. Tamil Nadu is now the first state to ban the egg mayonnaise. Telangana had imposed 1-year ban last November. The Tamil Nadu government's decision follows similar bans on gutka and pan masala, both identified as hazardous food products. Recently, the Punjab's Food and Drug Administration also imposed a 1-year ban on the sale of caffeinated energy drinks to the children near schools, citing serious health risks linked to caffeine and other stimulants. Very good move. Definitely, it should not be consumed because, and especially at that particular developmental stage, the children, they need not to consume. They should not consume all these things. Now, here is the description of one of the very important organization, especially from the perspective of prelims, which is the FSSAI, Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. Again, let's read about this, get to know a lot of information. It's an autonomous body established under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. It has been established under the Food Safety and Standards Act. What it means is it's a statutory organization which is consolidating the statutes related to the food safety and regulation in India. Vision to build a new India by enabling citizens to have safe and nutritious food, prevent diseases, and lead a healthy and happy life. Functions. It is responsible for protecting and promoting the public health through the regulation and supervision of food safety. You must have seen different food outlets having the FSSAI license number. So this is a mandatory requirement which these outlets need to have. It lays down the standards and guidelines in relation to the articles of food, provides for licensing, registration, accreditation. Anyone selling or importing food in India needs a food license issued by FSSAI. FSSAI also directly monitors the compliance of food regulations, especially in the areas of food imports to India. So not just the sale of foods at different outlets, but also the food imports. Its officers carry out the food import controls and ensure that they contain no harmful ingredients. To do this, they send selected test products from the import to accredited laboratories. The FSSAI is also responsible for the accreditation of the food testing laboratories. It is also responsible for the food certification in India, mandated to specify the systems by enforcing its standards for accreditation of certification systems and for certification of food safety management systems. So again, it is a body which is mandated to look into the food safety standards, certifies whether you have the safe food or not, and not just at the outlets, but also for the import aspects. This is what you need to know. It's a statutory organization under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. This is a particular act, Food Safety and Standards Act of 2006. That is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the Drug Controller General of India. So we have a lot of scientists who are requesting the DCGI to basically come up with strict pathways so as to make sure that the usage of the new antibiotics, it is done in a regulated manner. Because as we studied in the second article of the mains analysis, that if we have an unrestricted usage or the kind of overuse of these antimicrobials, what we say is antibiotics in this particular case, then it can lead to the development of antimicrobial resistance, which is a very serious, grave public health concern. So we'll see what the news is all about. Infectious disease experts have flagged the overuse of a potent antibiotic leading to losing its efficacy and drug resistance. See, if the drug is misused, overused, definitely it would lose its efficacy. That's the article is all about. The Drug Controller General of India has been urged to lay down the strict pathways for these new antibiotics so that they are not misused by the practitioners. The drug, which was initially registered with the United States Food and Drug Administration in 2015 and approved in India 3 years later, is a last line antibiotic. So it's a very important drug, antibiotic. It is to be used as a targeted therapy for certain carbapenem resistance gram-negative infections. I already asked you that. Do let me know what is gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, right? And which is the particular bacteria where you have the less effectivity of these antibiotics and not prescribed as a broad-spectrum antibiotic. The problem, he expresses, that while the DCGI has licensed the drug, it has only provided the indications for use. There are no clear-cut pathways laid out and nothing to deter its misprescriptions. So there has to be a restricted pathway, which is applicable to the usage of these antibiotics, right? This is very important. This trend could erode the huge gains secured in India, primarily with the ban on the use of cholesterol as a growth promotion drug amongst the poultry. We need these drugs in India. However, their use must be restricted strictly to the infections where no other alternative exists. We cannot use it, in every other case. It has to be used in a specific case. Education alone is not enough. We need a clear regulatory pathway to ensure the rational use of these molecules from the moment they are licensed. Antimicrobial resistance is already a serious crisis in our country. Without urgent and strong actions, it may escalate into unmanageable levels. It's a very serious public health concern. Let's read about the Drug Controller General of India. Probably a question in the prelims can come. The DCGI leads the Central Drugs Standards Control Organization. So CDSCO. You have a particular organization as CDSCO. So it is basically headed by the DCGI, Drug Controller General of India. The organization comes under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. They derive their powers from the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. So you have the Central Drug Standards Control Organization, which is a part of the Directorate General of Health Services under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Do remember. CDSCO, Central Drugs Standards Control Organization, it's a national regulatory authority. It's a national regulatory authority for the medical devices industry under the provisions of drugs and cosmetic rules, works under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. The DCGI is the head of CDSCO. Headquarters are in New Delhi. Under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, CDSCO is responsible for what? Approval of new drugs. Very important. Conduct of clinical trials for different drugs, different therapies. Laying down the standards for drugs. Control over the quality of imported drugs in the country, right? So even if you are importing a drug from a different country, the quality standards have to be decided by the CDSCO, whether it can be used in India or not. Coordination of the activities of the state drug control organizations. CDSCO, along with the state regulators, is jointly responsible for the grant of licenses for certain specialized categories of critical drugs, such as blood and blood products, intravenous fluids, vaccine and sera. So this is what you need to know, the ministry, the organization, and again, what are its functions. Very important. There can be a question in the prelims. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to a very important body, which is Serious Frauds Investigation Office, SFIO. Now, what this particular office has said is that we have the daughter of the Kerala's chief minister, and there are allegations that she basically diverted the Cochin Minerals and Rutile Limited's fund to repay her own firm's loan. So these are the allegations. Let's see what happens. But SFIO becomes really important and we'll read about it. So T. Veena, Kerala's chief minister's daughter, diverted the funds she received from Cochin Minerals and Rutile Limited to settle the debt of her firm Exalogic Solutions Private Limited with Empower India Capital Investments Private Limited, a company run by Sasi Dharan Karta, managing director of CMRL, and caused a financial loss to CMRL. This has been said by SFIO. the news is not really important. It's basically a political news, but SFIO becomes really important from the perspective of examination. The investigation uncovered the collusion between T. Veena and Sasidharan Karta to misappropriate funds. So we'll see what SFIO is all about. It is a corporate fraud investigation agency which was set up by the Government of India. Now this is very, very important. Was established in July 2015 under Section 211 of the Companies Act of 2013. Therefore, SFIO is a statutory body because it is framed under the provisions of Companies Act, accorded statutory status to the SFIO. This again becomes important. It's a multidisciplinary organization under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Under which jurisdiction? The Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Consisting of experts in the field of accountancy, forensics, auditing, law, information technology, investigation, company law, capital markets, and taxation for detecting and prosecuting or recommending for prosecution the white-collar crimes and frauds. You can have a reading of this. The SFIO can also take up cases on its own when decided by the director of SFIO, and also giving the reasons for taking up the case in the writing. Upon the assignment of a particular case to the SFIO, no other investigative agency can proceed with an investigation of an offence under the particular act, that is the Companies Act of 2013. SFIO is headed by a director, which is at the rank of a joint secretary to the Government of India. The director is assisted by the additional directors, joint directors, and others. The headquarters of SFIO is at New Delhi, with its regional offices at Mumbai, Chennai, Hyderabad, and Kolkata. So this information becomes really important. Do have a reading. Let's go to the last article of the day. Coming to the last topic of the day, this is with respect to the Central Industrial Security Force, a very important armed force of the country. Now we know that UPSC has been asking questions with respect to the defense related areas, also the armed forces. So this becomes really important. So the CISF has taken over the security of a particular airport in Mizoram. So let's go through the news and see what CISF is all about. The CISF, the Central Industrial Security Force, took over the security of Mizoram's Langpui Airport on Thursday. Langpui became the 69th airport in India to come under the protection of the National Civil Aviation Security Force. So which is the National Civil Aviation Security Force? The CISF. Maybe a statement can be there in the prelims. So that is what you have to understand. The CISF said it would work closely with the local authorities and other stakeholders to develop and implement the advanced security protocols that were effective, convenient, and people-friendly. Let's read about the CISF. It's an Central Armed Police Force, CAPF in India, set up under the Act of the Parliament in 1969 with a strength of originally 2,800, was subsequently made an armed force of the Republic of India by another act passed on 15 June 1983. The force has grown into a premier multi-skilled organization with the present strength of more than 1,88,000 personnel. Which ministry, which is the jurisdiction? So you have the Ministry of Home Affairs directly under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Home Affairs. Headquarters are in New Delhi. CISF at present provides security to almost 359 establishments, not just the airports, but also you must have seen the metro, the DMRC. Also we have some of the industrial installments, right? Refineries. So it provides security to those installations. Organizational structure. CISF is headed by the Indian Police Service IPS officer with the rank of Director General DG, assisted by the IPS officer to the rank of Additional Director General. The force is divided into 7 sectors: airport, north, northeast, east, west, south, and training. Right. So airport is a different sector and also has a fire service wing. So this is what you need to understand. So it's not just at the airports where the CISF provides security, but it also provides security at different installations, maybe industrial installation or maybe some others. So that is it for today. I hope you really enjoyed the session. If you did, do let us know through your likes and comments. All the very best. Thank you.